The moving truck rumbled slowly down Willow Lane, its heavy tires crunching over the neatly swept pavement. The morning sun bathed the neighborhood in golden light, catching on the pristine lawns, the white picket fences, and the orderly rows of flower beds that lined the driveways. It was the kind of place where mailboxes gleamed. Curtains were always drawn just so, and every detail seemed polished to perfection. For David and Monique Johnson, this was supposed to be the beginning of a dream, the moment they settled into a community where their children could ride bikes safely, where neighbors waved from porches, and where life carried the promise of peace. David stepped out of their car first, stretching his tall frame and taking in the sight of their new two-story home. It had pale blue shutters, a wide porch, and an oak tree in the front yard that seemed to invite shade and laughter. "We did it, Mon," he said softly, his deep voice carrying a note of pride. Monique, stepping out with her warm smile, carried their daughter's hand in hers. She paused to admire the house before replying, "Yes, we really did. This is where we're going to build something beautiful." Their children, Malik and Aisha, bounded from the back seat with uncontained excitement. Malik ran to the porch steps and declared, "This is ours now." His little sister clapped her hands, her braids bouncing as she laughed. For the Johnsons, this was the culmination of years of hard work. Late nights, saving, sacrifice, and determination. The house wasn't just wood and brick. It was a symbol of achievement, resilience, and hope for a brighter future. But as the family stood in their driveway, their joy did not echo throughout the street. Curtains shifted in neighboring houses. A woman in a pearl necklace, watering her hydrangeas, froze with her hose midair. An older man on his porch lowered his newspaper, his eyes narrowing as he studied the new arrivals. A pair of teenagers leaned on their bikes at the corner, whispering to each other before pedaling away quickly. The Johnsons, still savoring their moment, didn't notice the ripple of unease that passed silently through the neighborhood. From across the street, a small group of longtime residents gathered on the curb. Richard Campbell, the self-appointed guardian of the neighborhood's standards, crossed his arms as he watched the movers unload furniture. His sharp suit looked oddly out of place on a Saturday morning, but Richard prided himself on appearances. Next to him, his wife murmured something he answered with a tight smile. "They'll find out soon enough this place isn't for just anyone," he said under his breath, loud enough for his companions to hear. A woman beside him gave a hesitant nod, while another looked away, her expression uneasy but silent. Meanwhile, David carried a box labeled "Kitchen" up the porch stairs, pausing to wave at a neighbor who quickly turned and disappeared inside her house. Monique unpacked a basket of plants and set them by the steps, her optimism undimmed by the cool reception. She glanced at David and said, "It'll take some time, but we'll make friends here. You'll see." The air was thick with unspoken judgment, yet the Johnsons chose to focus on their joy. Inside, they explored their new home, opening windows to let in fresh air and letting their laughter fill every empty room. To them, it was a place waiting to be filled with love and memories. Outside, however, a different narrative was already forming among those who believed they had the right to decide who belonged and who did not. As dusk fell and the moving truck pulled away, the Johnsons sat on their porch, sipping sweet tea from plastic cups, watching their children chase fireflies in the yard. For them, it was a perfect beginning, unaware that beyond the glow of their porch light, the neighborhood committee was already whispering about how to keep them at a distance. The Johnsons prepared carefully for their first neighborhood committee meeting. Monique chose a soft blue dress that matched her calm, open demeanor, while David wore a pressed shirt and blazer, wanting to present himself as both approachable and professional. They rehearsed ideas at the kitchen table, organizing a block party, creating a tutoring program for the children, and hosting regular cleanup days for the local park. "We just want to show them we're here to contribute," Monique said, her eyes hopeful. David smiled and squeezed her hand. "Exactly. Once they see us for who we are, things will change." That evening, the couple walked into the community center hand in hand. The small hall smelled faintly of coffee and floor polish, with rows of folding chairs neatly lined up facing a podium. A long table at the front held pitchers of water and name placards for the committee members. Residents chatted quietly in clusters, their voices low, and when David and Monique entered, the hum of conversation faltered for just a moment before resuming. Some people glanced at them with guarded curiosity, while others looked away as though their arrival were an inconvenience. Richard Campbell, the committee president, stood at the front. His silver hair was slicked back, his suit immaculate as always. He offered no smile as his eyes tracked the Johnsons crossing the room. Instead, he leaned toward the secretary at his side, whispering something that drew a small smirk from her. David and Monique ignored it, choosing instead to sit near the front, eager to show their willingness to engage. When the meeting began, Richard spoke with a booming voice about routine matters, trash collection schedules, new streetlight installations, and upcoming landscaping contracts. His tone was self-important, as though he were delivering a State of the Union address, rather than leading a neighborhood discussion. After nearly 40 minutes, he finally opened the floor for suggestions. David raised his hand. For a moment, silence fell over the room, as if the gesture itself was unexpected. Richard's eyes flicked toward him with thinly veiled annoyance, before giving a curt nod. Yes, Mr. Johnson, is it? David stood, his voice steady and warm. Thank you, Mr. Campbell. My wife and I are new here, and we've already noticed what a beautiful, well-kept neighborhood this is. We'd love to contribute. We thought it might be nice to have a summer block party, where families could come together, share food, maybe some music and games for the kids. It could help strengthen the sense of community. For a beat, the room was quiet. A few residents murmured approval. A couple even nodded in agreement. But before the idea could take root, Richard leaned forward, his expression dismissive. That's interesting. But we've already got plenty on our plate with the 4th of July fireworks. We wouldn't want to overwhelm folks with too much, would we? He gave a tight smile, then quickly shifted to another item on the agenda, effectively shutting down the discussion. Monique, undeterred, raised her hand gently. Richard paused, clearly irritated, before gesturing reluctantly. Her voice was soft but clear. I've noticed several children in the neighborhood. I'm an educator, and I thought perhaps we could organize a free tutoring circle. It could help kids with their schoolwork, and parents might appreciate the support. This time, a few parents in the audience perked up, whispering to each other with visible interest. One mother even raised her eyebrows, as though the idea appealed to her. But before momentum could build, Richard chuckled in a patronizing way. That sounds very noble, Mrs. Johnson, but we already have excellent schools here. I'm sure our children are doing just fine without extra help. Let's move along. His words landed like a door slamming shut. A few members at the table smirked faintly, while others avoided eye contact, as though embarrassed but unwilling to speak up. David and Monique exchanged a glance, disappointment flickering between them, but also determination. For the rest of the evening, they listened silently as Richard steered the conversation toward potholes and fence regulations, never once returning to their suggestions. When the meeting adjourned, some neighbors offered polite nods as they filed out, but no one stopped to welcome them. No one extended a hand. Richard lingered by the door, shaking hands with his allies, his eyes sliding past the Johnsons as though they weren't there. Outside, beneath the dim glow of the parking lot lights, Monique exhaled heavily. Did you see how quickly he brushed us off? She asked. David slipped his arm around her shoulders, his voice calm but firm. Yes, but that doesn't mean we stop trying. They may not want us here, Mon, but this is our home now, and they're going to see exactly who we are. Their footsteps echoed across the pavement as they walked to their car, the night air heavy with unspoken tension. Behind them, the community hall lights dimmed, but the battle lines had quietly been drawn. The next week in Willow Lane unfolded with an uneasy calm. From the outside, life seemed orderly. Sprinklers clicked in the mornings, children played hopscotch on driveways, and cars gleamed in the sun after weekend washes. But for the Johnsons, the atmosphere felt colder than the summer air should have allowed. Each attempt at simple friendliness was met with a wall. When Monique waved to the woman with the pearl necklace while walking Aisha to the school bus, the woman quickly pretended to fuss with her garden hose. When David greeted the man with the newspaper during his morning jog, the man merely grunted and turned the page. It was subtle but unmistakable. The Johnsons were being kept at arm's length. On Friday afternoon, Monique decided to bake a batch of homemade cookies, buttery, soft, with chocolate chips still warm from the oven. She arranged them neatly on a plate, tied a ribbon around it, and walked across the street to introduce herself properly to one of the families. The door opened only halfway. A young woman peered out, her polite smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Oh, thank you," she said quickly, taking the plate but not inviting Monique inside. Before Monique could even offer her name, the door closed with a soft but final click. Meanwhile, David tried his own approach. On Saturday morning, he joined a group of neighbors, trimming hedges near the park. He picked up a rake, offered a cheerful, "Need an extra hand?" and began gathering leaves. Richard Campbell, overseeing the work like a general on parade, stiffened at David's presence. After a few moments, Richard cleared his throat loudly and said, "We've got it covered, Johnson. Wouldn't want you to trouble yourself." David paused, rake in hand, the unspoken rejection hanging in the air. Slowly, he set the rake down and gave a courteous nod. "Of course. Just thought I'd help out." He walked away, his back straight, even though frustration burned in his chest. That evening, whispers began to ripple through the neighborhood. At the corner store, Monique overheard two women murmuring near the produce aisle. "It's not about them personally," one said. "It's about preserving the character of the neighborhood." The other nodded knowingly, replying, "If we let things change too much, who knows what will happen?" Their words, casual yet cutting, echoed in Monique's mind long after she returned home. By Sunday afternoon, the undercurrent of hostility grew harder to ignore. As the Johnson children rode their bikes down the street, a pair of boys deliberately swerved close, forcing Malik and Aisha to wobble and nearly fall. The boys laughed and sped off. When Malik told David what happened, his father knelt down to his level and said firmly, "Don't let anyone make you feel like you don't belong here. You do. This is our home too." But behind David's steady tone, his eyes betrayed a flicker of worry. Later that evening, a letter appeared in their mailbox with no return address. The handwriting was neat, the words brief but sharp. "Perhaps you'd be happier in a neighborhood that suits you better." Monique read it twice, her hands trembling slightly. David took it from her gently, folded it, and set it aside. "That's fear speaking," he said quietly. "Not truth. They don't know us, but they will." The Johnsons sat together on their porch that night, the cicadas buzzing in the humid air. Their children played in the yard, laughter rising above the tension that seemed to settle over the street. Monique leaned her head against David's shoulder. "It feels like no matter what we do, they've already made up their minds." David's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "Then we'll show them with our actions, not anger, not retreat, but by standing tall every day. Eventually, they'll see we're not going anywhere, and we're more than the picture they've painted of us." As the street lamps flickered on and the neighborhood around them withdrew into the safety of closed doors and shuttered windows, the Johnsons made a silent vow. They would not be pushed out. They would not be diminished. This place was theirs now, and no prejudice could take that away. The night of the neighborhood committee meeting arrived with the weight of unspoken intentions. It was held in the large living room of Richard Campbell's house, a space that seemed designed for appearances. Polished oak floors, shelves lined with perfectly arranged books that no one had ever read, and a chandelier whose crystals glittered like sharp ice under the light. Chairs had been arranged in a stiff circle, and neighbors filed in one by one, their voices hushed, their glances sharp. Richard stood at the center, his presence commanding the room even before he spoke. He wore a dark suit, as though presiding over something far more official than a suburban gathering. Clearing his throat, he began in a voice both smooth and firm, "Thank you all for coming. As you know, our neighborhood has always prided itself on maintaining a certain standard, a character that makes Willow Lane what it is. But recent changes have raised concerns." His words hung in the air, the meaning unspoken yet unmistakable. There were nods around the room. A man in the corner, his arms crossed tightly, muttered, "It just doesn't feel the same anymore." A woman with perfectly coiffed hair added, "We all worked hard to live here. We can't just let things shift in a direction we didn't choose." Though no one said the Johnsons' name outright, the implication was clear. They were the change, that had unsettled the neighborhood. One neighbor, Mrs. Green, shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Her voice was softer, hesitant. "I've seen them out and about. They seem like good people. The children are polite, the parents friendly. Maybe we're overreacting?" But Richard cut in quickly, his tone dismissive. "It's not about whether they're polite, Mrs. Green. It's about preserving the harmony of our community. If we start lowering our guard, it sets a precedent. And once that happens, who knows what will follow?" The room buzzed with low murmurs of agreement. Fear mixed with prejudice, cloaked in words like standards and tradition. Richard, sensing the energy was leaning his way, pressed forward. "What we need to do is establish boundaries. We must make it clear what kind of behavior and image are acceptable here. If certain people can't fit into that, well, perhaps Willow Lane isn't the right place for them." As he spoke, Monique's cookies, David's efforts to volunteer, the children's laughter on their bikes, none of that was mentioned. Instead, neighbors fixated on imagined threats, declining property values, unwanted attention, disruption of their carefully curated environment. Richard painted a picture of impending decline, a slippery slope that could only be avoided if the community acted decisively now. They began drafting a list of rules. At first, they sounded reasonable on the surface. Noise limits, yard maintenance standards, expectations for community involvement. But as Richard guided the discussion, it became clear the rules were designed with precision to box the Johnsons into a corner, to scrutinize every action until life became unbearable. Someone suggested limiting the number of guests allowed at gatherings. Another proposed stricter oversight of unsightly decorations. And yet another mentioned monitoring property use for unusual activity. Each rule was carefully worded to appear neutral, yet everyone in that room knew exactly whom they targeted. Not everyone was comfortable. Mrs. Green spoke up again, her voice firmer this time. "This feels wrong. We're talking about neighbors, real people. What you're suggesting sounds less like preserving harmony and more like pushing someone out." Silence fell for a moment, eyes turning toward her. Richard's jaw tightened, but he managed a thin smile. "We're not pushing anyone out, Mrs. Green. We're protecting what we've built. Surely you can understand that." The pressure in the room was heavy, and though Mrs. Green looked unconvinced, she sank back into her chair, outnumbered and isolated. By the end of the night, the committee had formed a plan. A letter would be drafted, outlining the new rules, framed as a neighborhood improvement initiative. Flyers would be distributed, ensuring every household understood what was expected. And if the Johnsons struggled under the weight of those rules, well, that was simply proof that they didn't belong. As the meeting broke up, neighbors left in small clusters, whispering and nodding to one another. Richard remained behind, tidying the papers on his table with meticulous precision, satisfaction evident in his every movement. In his mind, he had secured the neighborhood, drawn a line in the sand. But what he failed to recognize, or perhaps refused to admit, was that his campaign of exclusion had planted seeds of division, not just against the Johnsons, but among his own neighbors as well. Some walked away uneasy, their consciences troubled, even as they lacked the courage to speak up. Meanwhile, across the street, the Johnson home glowed warmly in the night. Inside, David read a bedtime story to Malik and Aisha, their laughter rising like music against the shadows outside. Monique tidied the kitchen, humming softly to herself, unaware of the scheme that had just been set into motion. In the stillness, their love and resilience stood in quiet defiance against the storm that was about to break. Word of the Johnsons' efforts began to ripple quietly through Willow Lane, carried not by announcements or grand gestures, but by the steady, undeniable presence of their kindness. Parents whispered to one another about how Monique's tutoring circle had helped their children raise grades and confidence. Families who had attended the Johnsons' open backyard barbecues spoke of the warmth they felt, of the laughter and shared food that broke through walls of suspicion. Even those who had kept their distance started to see that the Johnsons weren't agitators or outsiders at all, but neighbors who were investing in the well-being of everyone around them. The committee, however, grew restless. Richard Campbell, once certain of his firm grip on the neighborhood, began to notice the subtle shift in loyalties. At meetings, people were less quick to nod in agreement with him. Some even hesitated before voting in favor of his motions. He could feel the ground beneath him slipping, and in his frustration, he sought to rally his allies with sharper words. "They're trying to take over," Richard declared at a tense gathering in his living room. He leaned forward, eyes narrowed, voice tight with indignation. "Every week it's something new. Free tutoring, barbecues, lawn work. These are not harmless gestures. They are calculated moves to win people over. If we're not careful, they'll push us aside and dictate what this community becomes." His words stirred unease in a few, but others shifted uncomfortably. A younger neighbor, Tom, who had recently joined the committee, finally spoke up. "But isn't that what community should be? They're helping people. They're filling gaps we've been ignoring. Honestly, Richard, maybe we should be working with them instead of against them." The room grew tense. Richard's face flushed, but he forced a tight smile. "You're naive, Tom. You don't understand the long-term consequences. If they lead, we lose control. And once control is gone, the neighborhood loses its value. Property values decline, standards dissolve, and all the work we've put in is gone." His argument was laced with fear, but more and more it sounded hollow, a justification for prejudice that fewer people wanted to carry. Outside of the committee's walls, the contrast between words and actions grew sharper. Richard's flyers and warnings, filled with stiff language about standards and preservation, paled in comparison to the living, breathing reality of the Johnsons' influence. Children returned home excited about their tutoring sessions. Elderly residents quietly mentioned that David had helped shovel their snow or repair a fence without asking for anything in return. Even neighbors who had initially avoided the Johnsons found themselves disarmed by Monique's easy smile and the way she remembered small details about their lives. Rumors, once Richard's weapon of choice, began to backfire. When he whispered that the Johnsons were too ambitious, neighbors responded with shrugs or even defense. So, what if they are? At least they're ambitious about good things. When he suggested their events were a ploy, people recalled the laughter, the good food, the community spirit, none of which aligned with manipulation. The neighborhood was quietly dividing, though not along the lines Richard had planned. Instead of uniting against the Johnsons, residents were beginning to question the committee's leadership itself. Why had they allowed a small group of people to dictate what belonging looked like? Why had they been so quick to judge newcomers without offering a chance? Guilt crept into conversations over fences and across porches, a subtle but growing tide. Richard felt it most keenly in the way people looked at him. The deference he once commanded was being replaced by doubt, even irritation. Meetings became harder to control. His speeches, once received with nods and murmurs of approval, were now met with silence or scattered objections. And though he would never admit it, the thought of losing his grip on power haunted him in the quiet hours of the night. The Johnsons, meanwhile, carried on without fanfare. They weren't strategists or politicians. They simply lived as they always had, extending kindness, practicing patience, showing strength in the face of exclusion. Yet their authenticity spoke louder than any of Richard's carefully crafted rhetoric. Where the committee built walls, David and Monique built bridges, and the people of Willow Lane, weary of division, were beginning to cross. It was becoming clear that the neighborhood's future was no longer bound to the narrow vision of Richard Campbell and his allies. Something larger was stirring, fragile yet powerful. A belief that unity could replace fear, that leadership could be redefined not by who excluded the most, but by who welcomed the widest. The storm Richard had tried to summon against the Johnsons was turning, and now it threatened to sweep him aside. The evening of the annual Willow Lane community meeting arrived with an air of tension that seemed to ripple through the neighborhood. The Johnsons had debated whether to attend, uncertain of how welcome they would be after months of cold stares, whispered rumors, and thinly veiled resistance from the committee. But David had insisted, his voice steady and calm as always. "We've done nothing to hide from," he said as he buttoned his jacket. "If we're serious about building a life here, then we need to stand tall in the same spaces as everyone else. Monique agreed, though she smoothed her dress nervously in the mirror before they left. The meeting hall was held in the neighborhood's modest community center, a place usually reserved for holiday parties, bake sales, and children's art shows. Tonight, however, the atmosphere was anything but lighthearted. Rows of folding chairs faced a long table where the committee sat, with Richard Campbell seated squarely in the center, like a general preparing for battle. His face was taut, his tie perfectly knotted, and his eyes swept over the room with a calculating sharpness. Neighbors filed in, some greeting one another with cheerful nods, others slipping into their seats quietly. Conversations hummed through the air, many of them focused on one subject: the Johnsons. When David and Monique entered with Malik and Aisha by their side, the murmur shifted palpably. Some people glanced away quickly, embarrassed by the way they had treated them before. Others stared openly, their expressions unreadable. But then, unexpectedly, a voice rang out. "Evening, David! Evening, Monique!" It was Mrs. Carter, an elderly widow whose broken fence David had fixed without asking for payment. She raised a hand and smiled warmly, and several heads turned in surprise. The Johnsons responded with grateful smiles, and just like that, a small spark of acceptance flickered in the room. The meeting began with Richard calling order, his voice clipped and authoritative. He rattled through the agenda: neighborhood maintenance, a proposal for new landscaping rules, and then the topic everyone was waiting for: leadership nominations. Clearing his throat, Richard launched into a speech that seemed rehearsed. Every word weighted with intention. This community, he declared, has always been defined by its commitment to tradition, to preserving the values that make Willow Lane one of the finest neighborhoods in the city. We must be careful, vigilant, and selective about who represents us. Leadership is not simply about enthusiasm or friendliness. It is about upholding standards. The implication hung heavily in the air. Everyone knew who he meant. The Johnsons sat quietly, their hands linked beneath the table. But before Richard could continue, Tom, the younger neighbor who had grown increasingly frustrated with the committee's prejudice, stood up. His voice wasn't as polished as Richard's, but it rang with conviction. "With all due respect, Richard, maybe it's time we think about what leadership really means. Standards don't mean shutting people out. They mean lifting people up. And when I look around at who's been lifting this neighborhood up the most these past few months, I don't see it coming from this table. I see it coming from the Johnsons." Gasps echoed through the hall. Richard stiffened, his jaw clenching. "This is highly irregular," he began, but his words were drowned out by another voice. Then another. Residents rose one by one, recounting small but significant acts of kindness. The single mother whose son was now thriving in school thanks to Monique's tutoring. The retiree who remembered David fixing his roof during a storm. The children who loved playing in the Johnsons' backyard, where they were always welcomed with food and laughter. Each story layered onto the next until the tide of testimony became impossible to ignore. Richard attempted to regain control, his voice rising in protest. "You're being sentimental. Leadership is about responsibility, not—" But the words faltered as the room swelled with murmurs of agreement for Tom's nomination. For the first time in years, Richard's authority no longer carried the weight it once had. The people weren't looking at him anymore. Their eyes were on David and Monique. David rose slowly to his feet, his deep, calm voice commanding attention without force. "We never came here to lead," he said, scanning the room. "We came here to belong, to raise our children, to share in the good and the bad, and to contribute what we can. If you think we can serve this community in a larger way, then we are humbled by your trust. But leadership should not be about exclusion or fear. It should be about listening, about building bridges, and about seeing every neighbor as family." A hush followed his words, heavy with meaning. Then applause broke out, hesitant at first, then stronger, until the entire room was clapping. Richard sat rigid in his chair, his face pale with disbelief, as the wave of approval carried the Johnsons forward. In that moment, it was clear. The balance of power in Willow Lane was shifting. That night, the Johnsons walked home under the glow of streetlights, their children skipping ahead of them. For the first time since moving in, They felt not like outsiders, but like part of something larger, not because they had fought for it, but because they had lived with integrity until the truth spoke for itself. Election day arrived like a quiet storm, the kind that doesn't announce itself with thunder, but builds steadily until its weight can no longer be ignored. The neighborhood center buzzed with unusual energy, more residents than ever before showing up, many dressed as if for something far more significant than a local vote. People milled about in the crisp evening air, chatting in small groups, their voices carrying the air of anticipation. For once, the Johnsons were not invisible observers at the edge of the crowd. They were at the heart of it. Neighbors approached them with warm handshakes, hugs, and encouraging words. Children ran up to Aisha and Malik, asking if they could still play in their backyard after their mom and dad became leaders. Inside the hall, rows of chairs faced a small wooden podium and ballot boxes arranged neatly on a long table. The committee members sat stiffly at their usual post. But something had shifted in the air. Richard Campbell looked gaunt, his authority no longer ironclad. His usual sharp glances didn't send people into nervous silence. Instead, they were ignored. Even some of his longtime allies shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting toward the Johnsons with a mixture of guilt and curiosity. The vote began with brief speeches. Richard went first, his voice still powerful but hollow, as if even he no longer believed the words spilling from his mouth about tradition and standards. He tried to remind the room of the neighborhood's reputation, but his tone lacked conviction. When he finished, polite applause followed, thin, unenthusiastic, and quickly dying. Then, David rose to speak. He didn't stride to the podium like a politician. He walked there like a neighbor, shoulders relaxed, voice even. When Monique and I moved here, he began, his eyes sweeping across the room, we wanted nothing more than to raise our children in a safe, welcoming place. At first, we weren't sure if we had made a mistake. There were moments of silence when we passed by, doors that stayed closed, and invitations we never received. But then, slowly, we saw what community really means. Not in rules and regulations, but in acts of kindness. We fixed fences together, we shared meals, we helped one another when it mattered most. That's the neighborhood we fell in love with. Not the one on paper, but the one made of people who care. He paused, letting his words settle. If you choose us as leaders, it won't be about changing who belongs and who doesn't. It will be about making sure everyone belongs, no matter their background, their story, or the color of their skin. That's what real community looks like. Silence hung for a moment. Then the room erupted into applause, genuine, thunderous, and sustained. Even those who had once whispered against them were clapping, some with tears in their eyes. Richard sat motionless, his jaw tight, as ballots were distributed. The voting itself was simple. Slips of paper, names written and dropped into boxes. When the counting finished, the results were read aloud. David and Monique Johnson had won by an overwhelming margin. The announcement sent the hall into a standing ovation. Malik and Aisha ran up to their parents, hugging them tightly as neighbors crowded forward to shake hands and offer congratulations. Richard finally stood, his face pale and stiff, and gave a short, reluctant nod before leaving the hall without a word. No one stopped him. The focus was no longer on him, but on the family who had endured exclusion with dignity and turned it into leadership. That night, the Johnsons walked home under the stars, the cool air carrying the sound of neighbors still chatting happily outside. Their house, once the symbol of controversy, now stood as the home of the community's new leaders. Monique glanced at David, her hand slipping into his. "We did it," she whispered, her voice trembling with both relief and pride. David shook his head softly. "No," he said, smiling as he watched Malik and Aisha skipping ahead. "We didn't do it alone. The neighborhood chose a different path. They chose us." For the first time since they had moved into Willow Lane, the Johnsons felt fully at home, not just within their walls, but within the fabric of the community itself.